of the student fellows. The 6 have spoken. And there will be no break before the refugee experience because, again, we want to stick with our schedule for the live stream. So if everyone in the refugee experience panel could immediately get up at the end of human rights, and we'll just go right into refugee experience before having a break. Okay. So we're going to start now with Nicole. Don't forget, everyone on the panel, give us your name and your school before you start your presentation. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a real honor for me. My name is Nicole Brigstock, and I am the student fellow, one of the student fellows reporting from the University of Pennsylvania. And for the Pulitzer Center, I was researching and reporting on the anti-sex trafficking movement in Nepal. So a few years ago in 2015, many of you know that there was a 7.8 Richter earthquake that shook the country. This is a photo that I actually took when I was there in 2015, a few months after the earthquake. And the earthquake is really closely tied to the issues of trafficking in Nepal in recent years because thousands of people died as a result of the earthquake, and it really intensified the poor economic situations of many Nepalis. So when girls and women lost their families, they had very insecure living situations. They lost their houses, they lost their income, they lost their loved ones, and that made it very easy for traffickers to target young girls and women as potential people for the sex trafficking industry. So over the summer, I was living in Nepal for 2 months in the capital, Kathmandu, which is pictured here. And Kathmandu is a valley, so it's a very large city with a population of 5 million people. The country itself has 30 million people total. And although the city is surrounded on all sides by mountains because it is a valley. So on this side, you can see that we're in a city, but the further out you go, it becomes very mountainous and very rural, which is where most Nepali people live in rural villages like this one. So this is a village called Harkapur, which is like a 5-hour bus ride and a 3-hour hike. So many people live in situations that are very rural like this one. So even though 10 years ago Nepal implemented new legislation, which is on trafficking laws, so they have a much more encompassing and protective law related to what sex trafficking really is. And although the law itself is very good, when a law is made in a city like Kathmandu, the problem that I heard a lot doing my reporting is that it's not really being implemented in the areas where trafficking is occurring the most. So even though the laws are good, it's not really protecting a lot of people on the ground, the thousands of girls and women who are being trafficked each year. So basically for the Pulitzer Center, I had 2 different articles. The first was looking at legal justice and social justice. So in trafficking, a lot of times there's a focus on getting legal justice for survivors, which is extremely important. But also when people are trafficked and they exit their trafficking situation, whether that's them being rescued by an NGO, them being released, or them running away, what's really important is that they receive social justice and that they're able to reintegrate into society and to live a meaningful and dignified life afterwards, which is really what I was reporting on. So I wanted to look at what the anti-sex trafficking movement is like for survivors. And what's really interesting is that in Nepal, the movement itself is in many ways run by survivors for survivors. So this is the sort of sentiment that you have among the civil society in Nepal. This is a graffiti that I saw in Kathmandu. It says, "Women never retreat, women never surrender." And a lot of the people who I was interviewing and working with have this mindset that, there's a lot of gender-based violence and trafficking is a really big issue, but we're not going to let government bureaucracy stop us from fighting the issues and standing up for ourselves. So for my reporting, I was mainly working with a lot of NGOs. I was also interviewing lawyers who either through private practices or through nonprofit legal free clinics represent survivors and try to get them legal justice. Also working alongside survivors and the police officers, because when you exit a trafficking situation in Nepal, usually the police are your first point of contact. And unfortunately in Nepal, there are a lot of issues around stigmatization. So although there's a really unclear line between sex work and sex trafficking. I don't want to make any claims about where that line falls. But I do know from all of the reporting that I did in the country and talking to people who have done a lot of work in this, there's a real misunderstanding in the country about people who exit sex trafficking and in society are treated as if they were the culprits of crime rather than the survivors of a crime that was done to them. So many survivors are actually treated as if, you know, they were prostitutes, they chose to do this, they had other options, but they chose to sell themselves for sex. And although that is a personal decision, trafficking, the definition of trafficking is based on coercion, fraud, you're being tricked or fooled, you don't know what you're getting into. But unfortunately, in general, in Nepali society, it's not seen that way. So it's really important the work that civil society and NGOs are doing to rewrite this story and for people to really understand what trafficking is. So unfortunately, a lot of times when traffickers leave their trafficking situations, their families don't accept them upon return. They don't want to have anything to do with them. So it's really great that a lot of NGOs are providing them with like empowerment and job skills and education that they need. If they don't have any other things to fall back on, they can empower themselves and live a dignified future. So the Gentle Heart Foundation is one NGO that I got very familiar with. Arjun Dakkal is the founder of the NGO. And through my conversations with him, I learned a lot about what it's like to be a human rights defender in Nepal. So basically, the traffickers in the country have a very close-knit network. They work together, and they have a lot of money and power. And when you do the kind of work, so at this foundation, they have a recovery home for survivors, but traffickers see that as a threat. You know, this is their profit, and when you're protecting the survivors, you're hurting their business. So Arjun, he has literally been threatened to be murdered by traffickers, and in face of that, he's said, you know, like, I'm gonna keep fighting. If you're gonna kill me, but this is like my passion, this is what I really want to do. And so at this recovery home, they have women who are there for many years, and they learn education and job skills training. They have they basically learn how to make jewelry and make clothes and then sell them. So it's very economically empowering for them. And then the NGO that I was living at and working most closely with was Sasani, which means let's empower themselves. So Sasani was founded by 3 trafficking survivors, and they basically, you know, they're friends, and they came together and they said, you know, the government is very corrupt, they're not doing what we need them to do, so we need to do it ourselves. So one of the programs that they have is the Sisterhood of Survivors, and on the left is Garima, who is one of the founders of the NGO. And through this program, they work through GF Ventures. Basically, travelers come each week to the NGO, and the survivors lead a presentation, educating them about trafficking issues in Nepal and worldwide, and how, you know, how trafficking is occurring, what it really means, and what they can do to help fight it. And then after this presentation, the Sisterhood of Survivors, the sisters, they teach the travelers how to make momos, which are Nepal's staple dish. So this is a really great program that empowers the survivors, teaches them how to teach, helps them speak in English, and really helps them like reintegrate back into society and learn, you know, really great skills that will help them when they apply to jobs afterwards, or, you know, want to start their own businesses. And one really great program that Sasani does is its paralegal program. So they've trained 170 survivors to become paralegals in the country. So they're like the first point of contact in police stations. And in Nepal, like I said, thousands of girls and women are being trafficked each year, but only a few hundred cases are reported. And the thought with this program is that if the person that you're reporting can empathize with you and really understand where you've been, they're much more likely to feel comfortable reporting and to seek the legal justice that so many people aren't getting. This is the last program that they do, which is a trekking and tour guide. So Jasuda in this photo is leading a trek in the Annapurna region of the country to Poon Hill, which is pictured here. And like I said, this is a very empowering experience for survivors to have. But again, it shows that like when a law is made in the capital, it can't really reach a place like this. So it's upon the survivors to fill that gap themselves. This is LAC, which is the Legal Aid and Consultancy Center. So they provide free legal aid to survivors who want to seek legal justice, and they have really great, effective lawyers who provide them with free counseling and care. And then the note that I want to end on is that this is Dili Bazaar Jail. I mentioned earlier Sasani, the NGO that has those 4 programs, which is where I was staying. Just a few minutes walk down the street is this jail, and within this jail you have convicted traffickers serving their sentences. So what's really interesting in Nepal is that this poses a big problem for survivors because the place where traffickers are actively trafficking, where survivors are living, where NGOs are working, it's all in very close proximity, and there are a lot of security issues around reporting on trafficking and being a trafficking survivor in a country where most of the traffickers go undetected and you know, they're able to keep doing what they're doing. So thank you very much for listening.
So my name is Kiran Misra, and I am from University of Chicago, and I did my reporting in New Delhi, which is the capital of India. This is a picture of me with 2 of the workers at an NGO that I spent a lot of time working alongside when I was doing my reporting, because they're working in the informal housing settlements of Delhi, which is what I did my research on and what I'll talk about. So jumping right into it, there are 3 types of informal housing in Delhi. There are what you think of traditionally like slums, where there's thousands of people on land that is owned by the government, there's no running water, and people are living alongside animals, and there's no sanitation. And then a second type is resettlement colonies, which now that there's a lot of development, there's been a lot of people who've been displaced from their slums, and so they've been moved to new places where they're guaranteed housing and running water and things like that. But then there's also the middle ground, which is what this picture shows. So people who've been promised resettlement housing but have never received it. So this is just a wedding hall, an empty building that people were moved to 7 years ago when they were evicted from their homes where their families have lived for generations, but that the government said wasn't ever their homes to begin with because it was government land that they were seizing through eminent domain for the metro, so they had to leave. So they promised them houses in a resettlement colony and said, okay, we're just gonna keep you here for a few weeks and then we'll move you there. And 7 years later, people are still living here. A couple 100 families live in this one building, and I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of what that looks like on the day-to-day. So the homes are just separated from each other by sheets that people have hung from the ceilings. There's very, very little space, and people are living one on top of another with nothing like, you know, formal bathrooms or formal kitchens. So people are cooking and using sanitation wherever they can get it, however they can get it. This is another picture that shows the example of like there's dozens of families living in one area, and so there's just things everywhere and there's no sense of order, even though it's been 7 years, and so people have established a life, but this isn't really a good way to live for anyone. So then moving on to like, okay, so what about the few people who do receive housing from the government? So this is a resettlement colony. It's a little bit outside of the formal like downtown main city of New Delhi, and one thing that was really surprising to me to learn over the course of my reporting was that most people don't want to be resettled. Receiving a free home from the government, that is something that you can have legal rights to in the distant future and is actually made out of bricks and something that's actually more stable than just sheets of metal tied together with yarn, isn't actually something people want because it's often done in a really inconvenient way. So resettlement colonies are often really, really far from schools and hospitals and any places where people can get food or healthcare or give birth or find water. And so people who get moved here often have to stop attending school because it's too far, and they have to give birth in their homes instead of being able to go to a doctor because there's no doctors nearby. And so it's actually a big problem for a lot of people to be moved to this place that from the outside it seems great, you're getting a home from the government, but it's actually not all it's cracked up to be. So here's another picture of one of the resettlement colonies. And from the outside, things actually look pretty much fine, but it's when you go one level deeper and you see that people are completely cut off from access to anything outside of the colony, is when things start getting really tough. So if you can't get to work and you can't get a job, how are you going to get money to get food? And if you live somewhere where there isn't good ground for planting crops, how are you going to be able to plant your own crops? Because you don't have money, so you got to plant your own food. So there's levels of problems underneath different levels of problems. And the government under Prime Minister Modi right now is really thinking about, okay, on the national scale, we want India to be competitive with countries like the US and like China and like Japan. And so the metro is being constructed for the majority of Americans who, or not Americans, Indians who want to get from one place to another quickly and cheaply. But that's at a cost. And one thing that I really wanted to think about during my reporting is, what does it mean to think about the bigger picture? And in the bigger picture, who are the smaller people who are getting lost in the details? And so I got to meet with a lot of those people, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them in the coming slides. I'm going to come back to this part. So these are some of the women that I met, and I'm just going to touch on the fact that I pretty much only talked to women and worked with women and did reporting alongside women, not as an explicit feminist stance, but oftentimes if you want to get something done, that's how you do it. So I would go to, not in like a throwing shade way, in like a materially objective way. So I would go to one of the villages and I would want to talk to like the head of the village or the head of the panchayat, which would always be like some old man. And I'd be like, hey, can you tell me about what's going on? And he'd be like, I don't know that, I just sit out here and do my politics. But I'd talk to his wife, who would know, the person next door, his son is sick. And the person who lives above me, they haven't had running water for a week. And, that person who lives 4 houses down, I was talking to her the other day, and she said that her son used to be going to school and now can't anymore because it's just too far and too hard to go there. And so from doing all this talking and work, I realized that women know everything about what's going on in their community and know everything about what's going on with each other. So if I wanted to get any information, rather than going to like the village leader or the municipal council, what I should do is go to the women who are living this day in and day out, and for whom it really matters whether they have water and sanitation, more so than for the men who aren't doing the cooking and cleaning of the household in the same way. So going back a couple slides. So the government of India is really interesting in that it's made several promises to the people of India in terms of what it'll provide people who are low income. So there's different provisions that say that a certain amount of food will be made available to everyone. A certain number of public toilets per a certain number of people will be made available to everyone. Schools will be made available to everyone. But on the ground, this is actually not being implemented that well. So what a bunch of organizations are doing, and one that I'm working with pretty closely right now to interview them and figure out what their solutions are to this problem, and on the topic of solutions-based journalism, is called Nazdik, and those are the people from the first slide. And what they do is they also train women as paralegals, women in these communities, to know what the text of these laws are and what they can do if these things aren't being provided to them. So one of the things that the government of India seems to be counting on a little bit is that the laws that they've made aren't readily accessible by the people who need to avail of them. So if people can't read and if people don't have access to the courts, how are they going to do anything about the fact that they're supposed to be given like X amount of grains a day? So by giving the people access to the information that they need to file court cases and to file different petitions and to file different administrative remedies, these organizations are putting power back into the hands of the people who it affects the most in a way that's sustainable, not just flying in people from the outside to put a Band-Aid and then leaving and having the problem persist. So this is one of the women writing a petition that's going to be sent in to the New Delhi High Court. I don't know why this is so blurry. This is another picture of some of the women, but it's very blurry. Here are some more of the women with their completed petitions. And some of the paralegals are really, really young. Like this girl, Shanta, is I think 16 years old. And she's like kind of in the middle of the range of paralegals. Here are just some more pictures. So this slide I created just to say that like oftentimes entities like the government, and the government of India, which is the second most populous country in the world, can seem such an insurmountable force to come up against, and a force that it seems like it's impossible to win against. But just normal women living in like some of the poorest parts of the world have taken on the government and have won just by working within the system, and when the system doesn't work, making their own solutions. So I tend to resist wanting to be inspired by people who have been treated really, really poorly by the government, because it feels really exploitative sometimes, and I feel like instead of being inspired, I should be angry about it. But this is objectively very inspiring, and I was very inspired. So here's some more pictures. And you might wonder, like, why am I showing all these pictures? And this is one of my favorite quotes by Chimamanda Adichie, and she says, "We live in a world where we so often quote figures of the number of the dead in Iraq and Afghanistan and Congo until they become just that, figures. Every time I read these news articles, I find myself thinking, what do they dream about in Congo? How do they fall in love in Afghanistan? How do they resolve family quarrels in Iraq? What do they like to eat? Of course we must know about the dead and the dying, and of course these facts and figures are essential, but they should coexist with human stories. We should know how people die, but we should also know how they live." So one of the things that I really wanted to do through my stories was just to show how people lived. I mean, people are living really hard lives and are being treated very, very unfairly by a very powerful government. But in between that, they love their kids and they laugh while filing these petitions, and they have normal lives, and that also matters in the midst of all of these like big picture problems. And I don't want that ever to get lost in these stories about these big, big, important, like sad things that happen. Here's another picture. Here's another picture of me. And that's it.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Arianne Henry, and I recently graduated from Boston University with a master's in public health, focusing on global health and human rights. This presentation will be on my pre-reporting, as my trip will take place later this year. And I just want to start by saying it's been such a privilege to see the amazing work all of you have done, and I really look forward to learning more from all of you and to your feedback. So just to start, since antiquity, the female body has been endowed with both power and vulnerability. From fertility goddess to concubine to slave, gender and sex have determined many fates. Saint, mother, prostitute, wife, and virgin are common terms. Labels laden with presumed meanings, oftentimes overshadowing the individual. Throughout history, women have been abused, discriminated against, or subject to human trafficking. These legacies continue to impact women all over the world, including the disappearing women of Ethiopia. So why this story? Well, the disappearing women of Ethiopia are caught in a nexus of gender violence and inequality, climate change, and poverty, which are all factors paving their way to domestic work in places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other Middle Eastern countries. In their work abroad, they're traveling voluntarily and involuntarily through trafficking networks, and they face grave human rights abuses, including physical and sexual assault, confinement, and sleep deprivation, among other forms of mistreatment. Females, and in particular females from rural areas, face increased social pressure to migrate in order to provide additional income or to lighten the burden on their families. Tellingly, most immigration occurs in the first few months of the year after the coffee harvest in some areas. And while many Ethiopians do reach foreign shores, others may vanish without a trace. They drown at sea, or are abandoned in the desert, or simply disappear. This proposal will trace the journey of one or more females who worked abroad in the Middle East, and their experiences in particular reintegrating into Ethiopian society when they return. It will also take a wider look at the societal factors impacting such choices. I hope readers will come along with me and follow my questions on how to address these traumas, these injustices, by looking at what Ethiopians are doing in the form of female empowerment movements. So why now? Well, since taking office in April, the new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, has ushered in sweeping political, social, and economic changes. Just 2 weeks ago, actually, he appointed a cabinet that is 50% female. And just a few days ago, he appointed the first female president in Ethiopia's modern history. So there are remarkable changes taking place. Yet women, and in particular, as I said, women from these more rural areas, continue to be especially vulnerable to social inequality and economic instability. And just a little bit of context on Ethiopia. It is the oldest independent country in Africa. It has never been colonized, and it retains a unique, ancient, and diverse cultural heritage. It's also the second most populous country in Africa, with just over 102 million people, and it's a relatively young population with a median age of 18. And with some 27 million living on less than $2 a day, high unemployment rates, and an agricultural-based society, Ethiopia faces these dual challenges of poverty and climate change. According to reporting by Tom Gardner, back-to-back droughts have left 8.5 million in need of food aid. And most migrants, as you can see in this map, these are a lot of the routes that they're taking. They're using these channels because they're cheaper and faster. However, they're facing great danger. Just last year, hundreds of migrants were forced from boats into rough seas off Yemen, and where at least 60 migrants drowned. I'd like to show a brief clip. I do want to mention it is difficult material. It's a video that went viral last year. I wanted to mention, as her employer is filming her, she is saying in Arabic, "Oh, crazy, come here," while the woman is asking, "Hold on to me, hold on to me." And as reported by the Washington Times, she survived. She suffered a broken arm, and her employer was later arrested. But she represents just one of 600,000 foreign workers in Kuwait, according to Human Rights Watch. And after this particular video went viral on social media, it brought an extensive amount of awareness to the plight of female domestic workers, and there were cries, outcries for change. So what is happening when women return to Ethiopia? They're facing stigma and having difficulty reintegrating socially and economically. Some come home with physical injuries, while still many others report mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. And due to stigma and limited mental health care, many families are hiding their female relatives indoors as a means of protection. Some others will will send their female relatives to holy water sites. This is what's depicted in this particular picture here, where they sometimes do not return. Others report that family members are disappointed they've returned without money and in debt to trafficking brokers, and many make plans to travel back to the Middle East. So what is the purpose of this story? I'm really wondering, can we take a deeper look at the narratives surrounding violence and victimhood? Can we look at the lived, embodied experiences of these particular females within the context of systemic misogyny and see what lies on the other sides of their journeys? So what is being done to prevent, rehabilitate, reintegrate, and who is leading that effort? And this particular organization, Agar Ethiopia, they provide shelter, clothing, food, and psychological counseling. They're training women in vocational skills for income generation, and they trace and unite women with their families. This depicts one of the family reunifications, and I'm hoping to visit one of these while I am there. And additionally, they're providing education on radio, TV, and through community conversations to reduce gender-based violence and trafficking. Another organization is Sisterhood. It is a homegrown, uniquely Ethiopian feminist movement founded in July of 2014. And one of the many activities they undertake is a women-only group to discuss feminist topics. They also include men in these discussions, and they have a program to provide education at the secondary level. In addition to Sedowit is something called the Yellow Movement. Started in 2011 at Addis Ababa University, they seek to end gender-based violence and empower women. One of their recent campaigns, Justice for Hannah, was instrumental in bringing justice for a young girl who was kidnapped in 2014 by 5 men. So my plan, as of now, is to collaborate with an Ethiopian journalist, Hadra Ahmed, and we've already been discussing the story, and she has some colleagues that are doing some research. And my hope is to spend time with individuals in these core organizations while leaving time for developments that occur while I am there. A brief note, anticipated challenges in the field and what I've learned from all of you. I think the biggest one is that there is significant taboo. Already many individuals I've spoken with from Ethiopia, it is a very difficult topic to discuss. The implicit and sometimes explicit message is that there should be silence. So I really want to hold these challenges in mind as I meet with different individuals and bear witness to their stories. I'd also like to acknowledge, this slide didn't come out, but it was just a list of all the people I've thus far spoken with, and I'm so thankful to the Pulitzer Center, Boston University, the staff, John and Kim Sawyer, and all of the journalists, including my mentor, Gina Moore, who have been, generously shared their time and advice with me. In conclusion, I recently went to see Ophelia Quist-Arcton, and she's NPR's all-purpose Africa reporter based in Dakar, Senegal. And she talks about the importance of reporting on women and girls' voices. She says too often stories on African countries present a distorted view of conflict, chaos, and disease with little nuance or complexity. And she believes through the work of dedicated, thoughtful journalists who amplify voices, seek truth, and hold humility around unconscious bias, we will create responsible and effective stories. Thanks for listening.
Hi, hello everyone. I just want to start off by saying that I'm very nervous. I'm very bad at public speaking, so I apologize if you see me shaking or if I freeze. So my name is Argentina. So my name is Argentina, and I'm not from Argentina, just in case. I focus on why Chinese women, especially women living in Beijing and Shanghai, are delaying starting a family, specifically women ages from 18 to 29. So this relates back to the one-child policy and the second-child policy. In Beijing, I was able to speak to an amazing woman who's a teacher, and her name is Wayne Keyshawn. I hope I didn't mispronounce her name. And she basically opened up to me and told me her family story, and she told me how, due that she's a Han, which is an ethnicity in China, her family were able to have 2 children, and it was her and her younger sister. Her family wanted her to have a 3rd child to see if they were able to have a boy, so they left their community because they didn't want their neighbors to report them. Because sometimes neighbors, if they will find out you had another child, they will report on you. So they moved from the community, but the government still found out, and they had to pay a highly costly fine. Most people that can't pay these costly fine if the government finds out, so they're either abused or sent to jail. I meant like beaten. So to go back on the history of the policies, the one-child policy was implemented in 1979, and it basically prohibited women from having more than 1 child. Then in 2015, it was revised by women only having 2 children instead of 1. So as I mentioned before, it gets a little bit confusing because there are 56 ethnic groups in China. So some ethnic groups were able to have more than one child due to their limited population, like the Han. But now it changed because they're like the majority of the group there. The reason for this was, of course, to control the population rate, and it had a secondary effect, which is to increase the economic growth and for the social mobility of women and girls. To maintain these policies, women were forced to have abortions, abandon their kids, or give them up to adoption. The Chinese society have a preference for male due to that it will like pass on their name. So this consequently changed the gender imbalance in China. So to the Western perspective, this is a violation of women's rights, but even though this is a violation of human rights, women have somewhat became empowered through these policies because they, specifically women living in the cities, they were able to enjoy more opportunities when it came to work, careers, and work and education. They prefer to go to school and finding a good stable job than finding a mate, since they prefer to be financially stable. It's very expensive to raise a child in China, so they prefer to be financially stable and find a mate that makes enough money to raise a child there. As I mentioned before, Keyshawn, she was able to be raised with siblings, and I was able to interview a young woman from her university, and they both told me that they would love to have 2 children, but after they turn around their 30s. And the reason for this is because the other woman told me that she was raised by herself, and she remembers being very lonely. Although she was spoiled, she wished she had a sibling. And this tells me that women do want to take advantage of the new second child policy, but they want to do it after they find a stable job. Nationwide, the average age to marry is 27, but now in Shanghai, it's over 30. And the government does want women to marry early because there aren't enough, the birth rate is very low, and they want more children to be born. So the government has propaganda try to convince young women, especially in universities, to have children. And they try by saying that if they have it over the age of 30, their kids come out with disabilities and all these stereotypes of women having children over the age of 30. At the same time, it stigmatizes the woman because there's a saying that if you aren't married by the age of 26 or 27, you're considered as leftover, meaning like nobody wants you. And but at the end of the day, women aren't even listening to it. They're just still deciding to get married whenever they want to. In my observations, I noticed that I saw more girls than boys, and I found this interesting because there's more boys than girls. This is a marriage market in Shanghai, which was like my favorite part of the trip. And basically, parents go to this park, and they have a resume of their kids that show their occupation, their names, how old are they, and their goals in life to try to find them a mate. And most of these sons and daughters, they don't even know about this. They found this like silly. And since I'm new in journalism, like I've never taken a course in journalism, something very, not bad, but I got scared. I was taking pictures and I was recording, and this lady out of nowhere started like following me and yelling at me like, "Why are you taking pictures? We're desperate. We're struggling, and we want our kids to find a mate. This is so disrespectful." And I just didn't know how to react, so I just put like my phone away. And this was something very new. Like I had to understand that they're very desperate for the kids to find a mate. And the reason for this too is because they want their kids to get married and have children, but also like there's a Chinese tradition that they have to take care of, you have to take care of your spouse's partner's parents. So they're retired and they want to be taken care of. Many can argue that these policies are a violation of human rights, and as a result, many women have become empowered, and women are prioritizing their work, career, and financial stability over starting a family. Thank you for listening.
Hi everyone, my name is Joy Ikekhua. I'm the student fellow from Spelman College, and the title of my project is Star 6820 Pound, or like we say in Nigeria, ASH, examining sexual assault in Lagos, Nigeria. And I only have one picture because I've not done my reporting yet. It will happen in December. But just so you know, Nigeria is located in the western part of Africa, and Lagos is in the southern part of Africa. And more specifically with my project, I'm examining domestic violence, and I'm using families as a site to understand women and trying to understand what is going on with the lives of women. I'm hoping to understand why there's a cultural shift. So I use families specifically because in Nigeria, in Lagos, where I grew up, families represent the backbone of society, right? And it's not just you have a family that you pick, it's a man, it's a woman, and you must have kids. And this translates to you having more power in society, you being more respected in society. And a lot of the times, people go to great lengths to keep their families together. And so I'm really interested in what happens, when domestic violence is introduced. How do women decide, am I going to stay here? Am I going to leave? Do I resist? How do I resist a situation in a society that's telling me that I have no value without my husband, essentially? And so I'm hoping to understand the cultural shift, which is one that, when problems like this happen, you don't talk about them. Like we say in my local language, Yoruba, which translates to close your mouth, don't say anything, and do not tell anyone. And this issue is really important to me because I did grow up in Lagos, and these issues were happening around me. But I didn't really see it, right? Because it became a matter of like, okay, don't talk about it. It's not really happening. It's not there. It's just you and your family. You'll just deal with it. You just stay in the relationship with your husband, and we just call it a day. We'll figure it out. If anything happens, it happens. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. But lately, ever since immigrating from Nigeria to the United States, I'm seeing that a lot more women are speaking up. And they're resisting this idea of, I must have a man and woman to survive in society. And they're saying, no, I'm going to be by myself. I'm going to take this on by myself. And I'm going to navigate Lagos society by myself. And this is more important, Lagos as a whole, because when we're talking about the development of the African continent, and Nigeria specifically, we can't talk about moving forward without talking about the status of women. How do we support our women? How do we ensure we elevate and empower our women? And it also counters the narrative, because I'll bring in the government a little bit later, that Nigerian and African governments are ineffective, which is huge for me, right? Because being in the United States, all I hear all the time is like, yeah, the African government, the African president is this and that, which is true too, but not all of them. It's casually shifting from, Lagos doesn't care about women, Nigeria doesn't care about women, so Lagos might care about women, Nigeria still doesn't care about women, which is really important to me. In addition, I'm hoping to document the lives of these women who have been affected by domestic violence and who have decided to speak up and to leave those situations, and those who haven't decided to leave and how they're still navigating their situation. And I'm hoping to do this by highlighting the women who are in these situations and understanding, what do they do to find peace? How do you make money? How do you, if you have kids and you took your kids with you, how do you survive? How do you send them to school? How do you do all these things? And I'm doing this also by looking at organizations, NGOs in Lagos, like the Mirabel Center, which is the first rape crisis center in Lagos, who are helping women with counseling after experiencing domestic violence. And they're helping them with lawyers and helping them to get divorces and all these things. And then finally, I'll be doing this also by talking to the government, the Lagos government. So if you go back to the title of my project, those numbers is actually a hotline that you can dial if you're experiencing sexual assault or you've experienced domestic violence. And when you call that number, it's free also with 2 major phone networks in Nigeria. And when you do that, they can come help you and they can grab you and get you out of that situation. And so by the end of my project, I'm hoping to have an article, but I'm also hoping to have a photo series depicting these women in their current, in their own space and in their own happiness, and figuring out what they do to find peace, especially in a culture that still predominantly, says that you have no value if you don't have a husband with you. And some of the things that I'm still struggling with my project is recognizing that my project exists within the gender binary. So men also experience domestic violence, but I'm not so much interested in men because I recognize that men still experience a lot of privilege predominantly in Nigerian society. Another thing is that I'm also pretty nervous about information, right? So my plan is to go there and show up to the doors and just hey, I'd like to have access. I'm hoping I get invited, not have access. I'm hoping I'm invited into their spaces. But at the same time, that could not happen. But when trying to get a lot of information online, a lot of it is also not there. But overall, I'm hoping to write a story of hope. I'm hoping to write a story of resistance, of showing that even though the predominant narrative is that women are facing these things, it's also when women are saying, no, I don't have to deal with this. I'm going to leave and I'm going to start life all over again and do my own thing and be my best self. Thank you.
Hello there, my name is Adam Yates. I'm a student at Northwestern University. My project is called 291A, looking at education infrastructure in rural South Africa. I spent 6 weeks in South Africa creating a 30-minute documentary, which is obviously too long to show today, so I hope to cover the content of my film in this presentation. My story begins with these 2 people, Rosina and James Komape, but more specifically their son, Michael. In January of 2014, in his first week of school, Michael went to the bathroom at Mashlodamela Primary School, but due to the outdated infrastructure in his school, his bathroom was a dilapidated pit toilet, which is just a hole in the ground. Tragically, Michael fell into the toilet. Nobody knew he had gone to the bathroom except one other learner who was there with him, and he drowned and died, and his body wasn't discovered until the end of the day, when his mother came to school to look for him. Following Michael's death, there was outrage across the country, as there should have been. A lot of people were wondering, how is this possible that learners are going to school and they're dying in environments that are supposed to be safe and supposed to be about education? Why is the infrastructure so bad? There were already initiatives by the government in place to address this, and there seemed to be an added urgency to fix sanitation in schools nationwide, to fix infrastructure, especially in these rural areas. Flash forward 4 years, and tragedy happened again under very similar circumstances. Lumka Ikekhua, 5 years old, died in a pit toilet in her Eastern Cape school. This was about 2 weeks before I got to South Africa for an internship, and at this time, people started asking a lot more questions. It's been 4 years since Michael died. Why hasn't anything been done by the government? We thought there were these programs in place. We thought we were going to fix sanitation. But all of a sudden, we have a second child dying, and there doesn't seem to be any urgency. This is when activists really started to pick up the conversation, and it started to emerge on a national scale about addressing infrastructure and addressing sanitation as well. Before I get into the story specifically, I just want to show you some of the conditions in the schools. I visited a few schools in the Limpopo province, which is in rural South Africa. Just so you can tell, they have chairs that are broken. This is an abandoned classroom, but they had to abandon it because the ceiling was falling down and posed a threat to learners. This is an old classroom where learners would fall in the holes in the ground, and you can see all the abandoned material. This is a pit toilet that has been fenced off following Michael's death because it was so close to the ground and so dangerous. But at the same time, this is at Uthani Primary School. They have pit toilets still, which are a little bit higher from the ground, but still very dangerous. So the questions I was looking at with this project are, how did we get to this point? Is there hope moving forward? And why is it taking so long to fix infrastructure? And I kind of addressed it on a historical level, a legal level, and kind of just a human interest level as well. To start off with, how did we get to this point? The Bantu Education Act of 1953 separated black and white education under apartheid. This is a quote from the Prime Minister of South Africa and the architect of apartheid. When I have control of native education, I will reform it so natives will be taught from childhood. Equality with the Europeans is not for them. It was a clear purpose of the apartheid government to make education unequal because they saw how powerful education could be in empowering people. So it was very purposeful. This is a historically white school, the King Edward School in Johannesburg, and compare that to a rural African school in Limpopo. You can see the drastic differences. The next question is, why is this only in the rural areas? Well, historically, the Bantustans were self-governing areas under apartheid, which means the apartheid government had no control over them. They said you can govern yourselves, but that also meant they didn't have any access to national resources or help. So when it comes to building infrastructure, and when it came to building infrastructure like schools, people in the Bantustans had to use the resources that were made available to them in these rural areas. So that's why a lot of the buildings are made of asbestos and mud and these really dangerous materials. And if you look at the problems with infrastructure, so electricity and sanitation and access to water, the maps almost match up perfectly. So you can see how a historical injustice has managed to affect people today. And so then obviously the next question is, why is it taking so long to fix this problem? Apartheid technically ended in 1992. Nelson Mandela was elected when South Africa became democratic in 1994. 25 years later, schools are still facing these issues. So I'm going to show a short clip from the video, which are two activists talking about why they think it's taken so long to address this problem.
People 23 years ago were learning in dilapidated structures, and 23 years now, people are still.
I guess the sound cut out. Anyway, they basically, the two activists, they talk and they each have their own opinion. One says that the capacity is just much greater than the government's ability to teach, to address the problem. And the other one thinks that it's just too big the scale is too big in terms of being able to find all the schools that have the problems and then address them on a school-by-school basis. So then, what is the government actually obligated to do? Because we can all think this is the moral thing to do, this is the right thing to do, but I wanted to look in what the actual obligation is. And for that, I go to the South African Constitution, and Section 29(1)A, where the title of this project comes from, says everyone has the right to a basic education. Through precedent-setting cases in the past, this has now meant that education is an immediately realizable right, which means you cannot postpone it. Everyone in South Africa is guaranteed a basic education today in the moment, and if there's a problem with your education, it's the government's obligation to deliver it immediately. This has been cases over 20 years that have established this precedent, and it also means that all basic education includes the quality of the education, but also the quality of the learning environment, meaning the schools, meaning you have to have proper infrastructure as well. So starting in 2011, there were these protests demanding a set of norms and standards to hold the government accountable. And in 2013, we have the adoption of the norms and standards for education infrastructure, which set a 3-year deadline to fix infrastructure nationwide. It said there won't be any more pit toilets in schools, there won't be any mud buildings. And again, this was by November 2016. There was a regulation within there, kind of a small section that said this is true so long as other government agencies cooperate with the Department of Basic Education. The Department of Basic Education then used that clause to make an excuse for not meeting that deadline. So November 2016 rolled around, they hadn't met the deadline, and activists took them to court to say it's unconstitutional what you're doing, it's an immediately realizable right, we should fix our schools immediately. July of this year, there was finally a ruling handed down. I'm gonna have to skip through these, but these are some quotes for the ruling. Essentially what it said is, the government is obligated to deliver infrastructure immediately. The section in the norms and standards is unconstitutional, and schools should be fixed today. On August 10th, a few weeks after this was passed down, the Department of Basic Education appealed the order and said, actually, we don't think we should be held accountable. It's not fair to demand that of us. 4 days later, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, announced the Sanitation Appropriate for Education Plan, which seeks to eradicate all pit latrines by 2030, which seeks to fix sanitation nationwide. Obviously, I want this plan to succeed. Everyone wants this plan to succeed, but there are a lot of doubts remaining about the government's ability to do so, considering this is the 4th plan in the last 4 years to address sanitation. Questions have been raised about the quality of the data collected. A lot of schools were never even called, even though they still have pit latrines. And on top of all of this, sanitation is not the only issue. So South Africa, as I showed, there are physical infrastructure in the buildings. Schools don't have libraries. They don't have recreational activities. This contributes to literacy rates. Educational outcomes are directly linked to infrastructure and learning environments. 4.7 million South Africans are totally illiterate. So another big concern about this plan is that it's going to take attention away from other problems in South Africa, other infrastructure-related problems. Say we're addressing sanitation, but that's actually not enough. And I don't want to end on a bad note, and I also really want to avoid painting a wide sweeping picture of not just South Africa, but the rural areas. Because within these rural areas, there are still obviously incredible people, incredible teachers, incredible learners, members of South African society. So these were a few learners I interviewed at Botse Secondary School, and these are their dreams for when they grow up, and they all spoke so enthusiastically of how they want to give back to their community, how much they enjoy learning, despite being in schools where their roofs are falling down or they don't have electricity. This is still the future of South Africa. These are still incredible people, incredible learners who remain inspired despite these conditions. And I want to do, and the teachers as well have been doing a great job despite these infrastructure conditions. And then to wrap up, why is education so important? I believe education is so important, especially in a country like South Africa that has so much inherited inequality. To bridge those inequality gaps. It's an equalizer across society. Which we can build inclusion and participation. It is through education more than any other sector. Thank you.
So thank you all. Let's see, why don't you return to the seats, please? And that was a terrific panel. You took us all over the world, dealing with a variety of human rights issues. Do we have questions? Yes, Jonathan.
So I have a question for Kiran.
Even though I called you Jonathan.
Jonathan, custodial, LaGuardia Community College. So I have a question for Kiran. You mentioned how the head of the village wasn't really knowledgeable about the daily struggles that everyone in the village endures, but you also said that he was managing some of the politics that go on in the village. So how does he justify his role if he's not really knowledgeable about what's going on in his own village?
That's Is this one on? Okay. That's a really good question. I think a lot of it is chalked up to tradition and that the heads of communities everywhere in the world are traditionally male, and oftentimes that doesn't necessarily translate into men being more effective in leadership and men knowing more about their constituents, but that's just the way that it's always been. And so a lot of times, even though men aren't the most effective leaders of their communities, they have a lot of political power and social norms behind them to be elected into those positions and to stay in those positions. So even though the people who really know what's going on and who are really changing things are often women, the social history and the perceptions about gender that have existed for so many years are often insurmountable in terms of getting women to those political positions in the first place. But India is actually really interesting in that there's been a lot of recent legislation over the past couple of decades that mandates that a certain number of village leaders and political leaders in major parties and every different facet of politics in India, a certain number of those seats be occupied by women. And so in some ways, we think we in the West are just like doing so much better for women than any place in the East or any place in the global South, but I think we could also stand to learn a lot from policies like that because, you know, a mandate like that has changed things to some extent.
I have a question for you about taboos. And one of you brought up the difficulties in reporting on subjects that are taboo. But I think those of you who have already been have succeeded. And the two of you who haven't yet been, this may be something you've already thought about. You know, how are you going to approach your subjects? So this is a question for all of you. Go ahead.
Well, I haven't reported yet, but that is absolutely a concern of mine. And the advice that I've been given thus far is to collaborate with an Ethiopian journalist to make females in particular comfortable by having a female translator. And then as a resource, the DART Trauma Center, I think, talks about interviewing when the topic is very sensitive. And I think also just being real and compassionate is, I'm hoping, you know, a piece of it to help with that.
I agree with you.
Is it working? Go ahead.
I agree with you. I don't listen to the taboos. I'd rather just go to the country and see it on my own and speak to the women and understand them. That's what that's what I do. Like, I don't listen to what other people have to say or their taboos. Thank you.
I know I'm in a really unique position because it is my community and it is where I grew up. So I'm really lucky that I am able to infiltrate these spaces and be like, hey, like, auntie something, like, what happened, what's been going on. But at the same time, I recognize that the ways that, you know, even if just because I am from that space, I still need to be very careful about the way I word things and the way I ask things, and be very aware of reading people's body language and be very aware of really what's going on. And I'm also going to be there for a month. So I do also have the very, I'm extremely lucky in the sense that I can build a relationship with people that I don't know. So I can keep going back. I can keep showing up and being like, hey, I'm not just here to like take, you know, I really do care about the story. It's something that's close to my heart. And I'm hoping that you will let me share it.
I think I have two kind of non-answers to this question, but we'll see. So the first one is about taboos. So in India, it is like the opposite of a taboo to talk about all the ways that the government is failing you and failing everyone else. It's like everyone's favorite topic of conversation. So in that sense, I haven't really dealt with that as a taboo, but social norms are different, and this isn't necessarily a taboo, but it's just a place where norms are different, and norms of gender are really different, and things like feminism are thought of in a different way that's like also meaningful but different. And most of the time, I think my take on it is while doing my reporting and while talking to someone for whom these issues are like very real and they have to deal with the choices that they make and the way that norms play out in their society, that is like not the time for me to make my great feminist stance with my great woke feminist manifesto. There are like times to do that, and while I'm reporting and talking to women who might have ideals that I don't think are like, you know, what I would be able to do in America or what I would want to do in America, the time to make those arguments is not like when I'm talking to someone and like to criticize them for the way that they view gender or something like that. It's like accepting that it's a different culture and one that I understand because I'm Indian, but a different culture, and then trying to find out where power plays into that and where those levers of power can be pushed and pulled for greater equity.
Honestly, when I was reporting, although like the topics of sex trafficking and sex work are highly stigmatized and there are a lot of taboos within Nepali society, the people I was closely working with didn't really buy into those taboos. They were actively fighting against them. So most people who I was interacting with were on that side of it. And although there were times when, you know, people said things that weren't necessarily feminist or what I personally would agree with, like I just met them with respect and tried to understand where they were coming from. And yeah, there was never really an incident in which I was trying to talk to someone about something and they didn't want to talk to it. Everyone who I was working with who are in the anti-trafficking movement really wanted to talk about it and disseminate information and raise awareness.
Okay, yes. There you go.
Hi, my name's Sana. I'm from Columbia University. I want to ask a question to those of you who are working with kind of more sensitive, well, they're all sensitive topics, but issues of violence and trafficking. So, Nicole and Arianne and Joy. So I guess the question is about protecting your sources and, when you're specifically looking at traumatic events or domestic violence, and just making sure that some of your subjects not just consent, but know what they're consenting to. I'm just wondering what kind of steps you're going to take towards that, or if that's something you've talked to anyone about. Thank you.
Good question.
I am going to make sure I explicitly ask questions. So if at the start of something, the person I'm interviewing consents and says, yes, I understand what's going on, I understand everything. When it gets heavier, I will be very intentional about reading them. And so if halfway through the interview I notice that, something's a little off, they don't seem like they want to talk about this right now, or they're ready, I'll make sure to ask the question again, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to keep going? I can come back another day. It's okay.
Is this on? Yeah. That's a great question. I think I am absolutely, my intention is to prioritize safety. And I know I've learned some techniques about even photographing and protecting identity, especially in cases where they may feel a threat or there may be a real threat. So I'm definitely hoping to prioritize that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely an issue that came up a lot in my reporting. A lot of these organizations that are fighting against trafficking and working with survivors, they really prioritize the safety of the people, of course, and their own privacy. So a lot of times when you go to an NGO, you can't even see the people living there, you can't really interact with them. And when you can, and I was able to interact with them and learn about them and hear their stories, I would make sure that if I did include any stories about them, and if it could potentially put them in an unsafe situation or an insecure situation, to protect their identity, to give them another name in my story. And also just learning about the programs that NGOs themselves are running. If I were to have shared certain pieces of that information, that also could have, just the public knowledge of what NGOs are doing itself can harm the effectiveness of these programs, because then traffickers have the inside scoop. So if I was ever including something and I wasn't sure if I should be including it, then I would make sure to talk to the NGO and be like, I know you mentioned this in the interview, but is it actually okay for me to include it? So just being very open in conversation and making sure that if I had any concerns, that they were being addressed rather than me just making assumptions about what I was including and if it was okay or not.
Other questions? Anybody? Yes.
Okay, hi, I'm Amanda from Westchester Community College. My question is for Nicole. I noticed that you had graffiti, in your presentation. Was there a lot of graffiti in Nepal, and do you think that graffiti is a form of, or a better form of communication for the region that you were in?
That's a really good question and a really interesting one. Actually, the picture that I showed is pretty common, at least in the capital, where there's a lot of buildings and it's easy to just make graffiti. It seemed like a very common practice, and the cool thing about that graffiti is that was just one piece along a very long street of entirely feminist graffiti, which is what really caught my eye, because I was like, you hear stories about South Asia and how women's rights are being abused, but this is giving you the other angle. These are feminist human rights activists who are raising awareness and making art out of it. So it was very common in Kathmandu, in the capital, but I would say it's pretty uncommon in more rural areas of the country.
Thank you. And your name and school.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kylie from, now it's picking up, from Wake Forest, and my question is for Joy. I know you haven't done your reporting yet, but do you find yourself being able to see any parallels with the Me Too movement or any kind of social media presence there?
Yes, in some ways, right? Because women are speaking up and saying this is happening to me too, which I think is phenomenal. But at the same time, like, this has been going on for years. Even before the Me Too movement became so mainstream, like, women were still resisting, even though it wasn't so pronounced and so out there. So it is yes and no. Yeah.
Yes. There you go.
Hi, my name is Svanika. I'm also from the University of Pennsylvania. And this is kind of like a more general question to everybody. Like, a lot of the cases you spoke about how legal and institutional changes were galvanized almost by like social changes, like whether it was like the Delhi women who were signing petitions or like the video that went viral about the Kuwaiti women. So were there any instances that you thought like civic leadership or just people who were especially effective in creating that social transformation to push then the legal and the institutional changes?
So is that directed towards everyone? Or?
Is this working? I think that's a great question, and I think that in particular that video that went viral, I think really speaks to that, where you see this impetus really driven by social movements. And I still haven't gone and done my reporting, but get that sense that it is galvanizing institutions and all the way up into the political arena. So I think it's a really effective and important.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
It's Jonathan again. So I have two separate questions. One is for Adam and one is for Argentina. So for Adam, I wanted to know, you said that they had plans on the way to get rid of all the pit toilets by 2030. Has that project been underway already, or when is it going to start? What's the cost of it? How do people feel about it in general? Are they optimistic? And for Argentina, did you come across anyone who didn't want to have children at all?
So the plan has begun. They're in the beginning phases, so they're meeting with people to figure out the specific details for rolling out. Originally, it was like the original estimates were a multi-billion rand operation, which is the South African currency. But there is cautious optimism around it. There's come to the point where people think the government has no choice, and so they have to finally follow through. But at the same time, they've had to follow through many times in the last few years, and they've had plans before, and it hasn't come through. And as I mentioned, a bunch of schools aren't even on the audit list of schools that need new pit latrines, and these are schools I went to and saw with my own eyes that they actually still have pit latrines. So there's cautious optimism around it, but I guess time will tell whether or not it actually happens.
To answer your question. To answer your question, no. All the women I met want to have a child, especially two. But after the age of 30, like around their 30s, so they do want to take advantage of the second child policies.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we're going to wrap this up now, but I have one final question for all of you. And Adam, one of your slides was, is there hope moving forward? So I'd like all of you just to give us a very quick answer about that. You don't have to say yes, you could say no. If you do say yes, if you could describe it in what field, or whether it's education or something else. And why don't we sit, Adam, since it's your question, we'll start with you.
One of the activists I interviewed, I asked that question, and she said, there always needs to be hope, but you can't have hope alone, and you need hope combined with action. And I think that's the perfect answer, that there is hope that we can make change, or activists can make change, and educators and lawyers can make change, but you need the action put behind that hope in order to actually get what you want done.
My answer is also yes, and that's a sentiment that I got doing my reporting with a lot of the people who are fighting trafficking, is that they also think that there's hope and that the work that they are doing is going to make the situation better for many Nepali girls and women. So the main hope is in preventing the crime from occurring in the first place through education and awareness and empowerment programs and more opportunities for young girls, and also hope that survivors will become empowered through the work that civil society is doing.
Yeah, I think unsurprisingly, my answer is also yes, there is hope. Kind of to the effect of like, I don't think anyone would be doing the work if there wasn't any hope, but the fact that there are so many people who are motivated to try to do this work means that there's a lot of hope, and things are really changing over the past couple of years. The government has been forced to fulfill a lot of the public service promises that they've made. But also just in India generally, right now we're in a time where like a lot of things are changing really quickly. Like I think a couple weeks ago or a month ago, the part of the law that criminalized homosexuality was struck down. And so things are really changing on a huge scale really rapidly, and yeah, like more so than any like largesse on the part of the government or those in power, but people are pushing really hard for the India that they want and that they imagine, and so it feels like there's a lot of hope.
I would also say yes, there's hope. There's so much hope because we're talking about a cultural shift from not being able to talk about these issues to now talking about any and everything. And I'm just like, whoa, like I didn't know we could talk about that. So I'm hopeful, and it's not just people talking about things, right? The government is also doing something about it.
When it comes to my topic, it's kind of tricky, but I feel like when it comes to the Chinese government controlling women's reproductive rights, I feel like there's no hope when it comes to that because it's been going on for decades. Like they're deciding how many children they can have unless these laws changes. But when it comes to women having children, they do want to have children, just not at an early age.
And similar to the other responses, I think there is always hope. I also think it's complicated within the context of trauma, and I'd really like to honor and put that question to the people that I speak with. But at the same time, I also have seen and heard from people in Ethiopia that there's great hope and optimism, especially in terms of these grassroots movements in empowering women.
Thank you. Those are